So jumping right in, a quick intro. So if you're not familiar with Green Energy Consumers Alliance, we are a nonprofit organization working across Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And our mission is to empower consumers and communities to speed a just transition to a zero carbon world. What that means is we run a bunch of different programs and services that help people access various clean energy technologies, whether that's solar or wind or heat pumps or energy efficiency, or electric cars. And then we do public policy advocacy work at the state level to make sure that we've got supportive policies on the books being implemented to make sure that we can actually reduce our emissions at the pace needed and in a way that fairly distributes all the benefits and costs. So today, obviously, we're going to talk about electric cars, but if you have questions about any other clean energy technologies, we're happy to help. Oops. My name is Anna Vanderspeck. I'm our electric vehicle program director, and I'll be giving the presentation today, but my colleague Caitlin is on as well, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hello, everybody. I'm Caitlin. I'm the Drive Green intern, and I will be in the Q&A looking out for your questions and answering to the best of my ability.
So if you have any questions, please do feel free to put them in the chat. We have muted everybody for the duration of this webinar to just prevent us from having background noise, but we absolutely welcome your participation. We'll answer questions at the end of the presentation. So throughout the presentation, if you have a question, if you navigate to your Zoom menu and click on chat or Q&A, you can type in a question and we'll respond to it at the end. As I just said, the Q&A function. If you would like to use closed captions, you should have a CC at the bottom of your screen in the little Zoom menu panel. And if you click that, you'll see captions generated in real time as I speak. So please go ahead and do that if that is something that you would like. And then just in advance, if anybody has questions about this, we will share slides and a recording of the webinar after the webinar. So you'll get an email with that information in the next couple of days. So what are we going to talk about today? We are going to talk about how cold weather or cold temperatures specifically impact the range of an electric vehicle and what to do about it. We'll talk about the importance of heat pumps. We'll talk about beyond temperatures, what snow and ice and winter weather do for winter driving and winter charging. And then we'll give you some top tips about how to make the most of your electric vehicle in a New England winter. So first question that people have when it comes to winter and electric cars is my range going to go down in the cold? And the answer to that is yes. Why? There are two reasons. So first, chemical and physical reactions that are required in the battery to actually make the vehicle move happen more slowly in cold temperatures. So you end up needing more energy to move an equivalent distance than you would in warmer temperatures, and we'll show you some data on that later. And secondly, you want to stay warm. So when you use energy to warm yourself, so either through heating the cabin air or using the heated seats or heating steering wheel, that all takes energy that obviously then isn't used to move the vehicle forward. In addition, the vehicle will take some of the energy stored in the battery to warm the battery up to an optimal temperature because batteries are a little picky and they have a sort of range of temperatures where they operate optimally. So to make sure that you're getting the best performance out of the battery, it will use some of its own energy to warm itself up, and those two things will both reduce your range. It's important to note that when it's cold, gas-powered vehicles perform less efficiently as well. So if you're currently driving a gas car, you also see a lower range in the winter. You might not notice the same way you would in an electric vehicle because the EV tells you at all times, here's how many miles you have left in your range. But that principle is true there too. The next question we get is, okay, if my EV's range is going to decrease, how much is it going to decrease? And that depends. So the short answer is in freezing conditions, meaning under 32 degrees Fahrenheit, you can expect a range loss anywhere between 10 and 30% roughly. But the long answer is that how much range you lose is going to depend on lots of different factors. So some are specific to the vehicle. So the particular battery chemistry of the vehicle that you're driving, how did the manufacturer decide to value performance in the cold? It matters on how you're heating yourself, and we'll talk about the different technologies in vehicles for heating. But then some of it also depends on the conditions. How, when we say freezing, do we mean 32 degrees Fahrenheit or do we mean 0 degrees Fahrenheit? Is the vehicle parked inside or outside? Are you preconditioning the vehicle, meaning are you turning the vehicle on and heating it up while it's still plugged in and charging, or are you starting sort of from the cold? And which heating features do you choose to use as opposed to which ones are installed, but which ones are you using? How high are you turning the temperature inside? All of these things will impact the range of the vehicle, but the sort of high level answer is somewhere between 10 and 30%. Let's go to the next slide. I've alluded a couple times to the fact that the heating technology matters. And there's basically two ways that vehicles will heat the cabin air, which is the most energy intensive part of heating, as opposed to the heating the steering wheel or heating the seats is relatively energy efficient. Heating the air in the cabin takes a lot of energy. Early electric vehicles used resistive heaters where you are running electricity through a conductor to produce heat, and this is very energy intensive. In a gas car, when you heat the vehicle, a lot of that heat comes from waste energy because gas engines are pretty inefficient. About 80% of the energy in a gallon of gasoline is lost, and a lot of that is to the production of heat. So when you get in a gas car, a lot of the heat that you're circulating through the cabin is coming from the fact that you're burning a fuel and that produces heat. In an electric vehicle, you have to do a different route. And again, the early models use this resistive heater, which is very energy intensive. Increasingly, the market is switching to heat pumps. So if you have heard of air source heat pumps for home heating or building heating, the same technology is increasingly being installed in electric vehicles. And so rather than producing heat by running electricity through a conductor, heat pumps move heat. So they don't generate it, they move it from outside to inside using a condenser with a refrigerant. So the easiest way to think of this is basically like an AC running backwards. And heat pumps are much, much, much more efficient than resistive heaters. So in the building space, when we talk about decarbonization, we're talking about replacing old propane or diesel or gas or old electric resistance heaters in homes with heat pumps. Now we're doing the same thing in vehicles. There's a company called Recurrent Auto that does a lot of research into electric vehicles, and they studied 10,000 EVs real world driving experience. And we really like this study because A, it's a really big sample size. 10,000 EVs is a lot of EVs. And two, it's a real world driving experience. A couple years ago, when we were giving this presentation, a lot of the data that we were pulling from was from labs, basically somebody simulating winter driving with a small number of vehicle models to compare their performance. But we're now at a point, because there's so many EVs on the road, that we can do studies of thousands of the vehicles and their real world driving experience. And so in this recent study, what Recurrent found was that EVs with heat pumps retain about 87% of their range in freezing temperatures, compared to only 72% for EVs without heat pumps. So if you're driving an EV with a heat pump, on average, your range decreases around 13%. If you're driving an EV without a heat pump using a resistive heater, then your range decreases about 28%. And that's a big difference. I will say that when we have surveyed people in the past about their experience with their electric vehicles, what the biggest surprise was, and most people have responded, the impact of the impact of winter on range. So that is a learning curve that a lot of people have experienced, but the EVs that are available these days have well over 200 or 300 miles of range on average across the year. So even in the winter months, they've got well over 100, 150, 200 miles, depending on which vehicle you're looking at, even if you take into account this range loss. So we link to this recurrent study here and in a couple places, and we'll share that information when we share the slides. But top line to remember is that an EV with a heat pump is about 10% better, the difference between 72 and 87, than an EV without heat pumps. Recurrent auto in that same source gives this example to show on a really, really apples to apples basis the impact of heat pumps versus no heat pumps. And it uses as an example the Tesla Model 3. The 2022 model of the Model 3 did not have heat pumps, but the 2021 model of the same vehicle does. And so it allows you to compare really closely the impact of just switching out that one technology because basically all the other elements of the vehicle stayed relatively the same. So what this graph is showing us is what percent of the real range, what percent of the total range is available in that vehicle at different temperatures. So you can see that at 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 100% of the real range is available. 65 is basically a battery's favorite temperature. And then moving from the right to the left, as the temperatures drop, you see that less and less of the real range is available to the driver of this vehicle. The y-axis does not start at 0%, so the most reduction you see in the 2020 model year is down to 65%. In just those couple of years since 2020, vehicle performance has gotten even better. But what this graph shows you is that the real range available decreases faster on the model without the heat pump compared to the model with the heat pump. Without the heat pump, it's a pretty linear decrease. With the heat pump, it's a slightly different curve. Basically, for temperatures between 40 and 65, it decreases less and then it starts decreasing a little bit more. But you can see that even with this vehicle, which is the first iteration that had a heat pump, at 15 degrees, which is well under freezing, you still had 70% of the vehicle's battery available to you. So this is only one vehicle model. Every vehicle is going to have a different graph, and I'll show you some more information about that shortly. But this illustrates that split between the heat pump and the non-heat pump in EVs. We have a very generous Tesla Model 3 driver named Rod, who a couple years ago shared some data with us on his experience with his Model 3 to show you one person's example, basically, of that graph that we just saw. So there's a lot going on in this graph, and I'll do my best to explain it. But basically, on the y-axis, you see temperature ranges. So on the left, it's from -5 to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 to 5, 5 to 10, all the way up in sort of 5-degree increments, all the way up to 95 to 100%, 100 degrees, excuse me. And then the bars that you see are the number of miles recorded by this particular vehicle driving around in Rhode Island in each of those temperature brackets. So you can see that the majority of the driving happens above freezing. So if you look at basically everything to the right of the 30 to 35 bar, everything to the right, those are miles driven above freezing, essentially. And you can see that most of them happen between 40 and 80, I'd say, just sort of looking at this quickly. And then what the line shows you on this graph is what the efficiency is, basically what the available range is compared to the EPA average for that vehicle. So you'll notice in a couple places, you can see that the vehicle is over 100% efficient. What that means is that it's getting more than the range designated by the EPA, which is intended to be a year-round average. So in the summer months, a lot of EV drivers see more range than is designated by that figure. And then in the winter, you see less. So most of the time, it's within 10% basically of 100%, somewhere between 90 and 110%. When it gets a lot colder, you can see that you start to see a decrease. So at 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, we're at 90% efficient, then 35 to 40, 82. So that's about 18% reduction around freezing. And then it decreases further and further as it gets colder. Um, a couple things that jump out here is that there are some weird bumps. Like for some reason, the vehicle was more efficient at -5 to 0 degrees than it was at 0 to 5. Those sort of details are going to be as a result of some of the other factors we talked about at the beginning in terms of was the vehicle preconditioned? Was it parked inside or outside? Um, what kind of driving were you doing, highway versus roads? These things will impact efficiency too, but this graph can show us basically the efficiency is above 100%. We're very close to it for most of the miles recorded. The efficiency generally decreases with temperature, but there's some variation. And then the temperature range where you see the most impact is absolutely the fewest miles driven over the course of a year. So this is one cool snapshot. Everybody's driving and parking and vehicle habits are different, but we thought this was really helpful data, and big thanks to Rod for sharing this with us to illustrate this really on the ground in Rhode Island. So which vehicles have heat pumps? Luckily, the list is now so long that we can't comfortably show it on one slide. So instead, we have linked here to a list by Recurrent Auto again. Their list is great. It shows you not just the model, but specifically the model year and the model trim, because some vehicles will come with one option that has a heat pump and one option that doesn't. So if you want to take a look, Recurrent Auto maintains that list. Some popular models that you might have heard of, all of the models of the Chevy Blazer EV and the Equinox EV, which just came out this year and are some of the most affordable EVs. They're less expensive than the average new gas-powered car, even before any incentives. They all have heat pumps built in. The 2025 Ford Mustang Mach-E does. Certain trims of the Hyundai Ioniq 5 and 6 do. Nissan Ariya does. Certain trims of both the Rivian truck and the Rivian SUV do. And then at this point, all models of the Tesla Model 3, Y, S, and X. Recurrent Auto has a lot of data, and I've taken a screenshot of one of their infographics on the right. And it will show you specifically which models have the best performance in cold weather. So if this is something that's very, very important to you, you can take a look. In this little graphic, you can see that the Tesla Model X, Model S, Model 3, Audi e-tron, they're all the best performing vehicles. And that little image of a fan that's red, that indicates the vehicle has a heat pump. So the best performing vehicles in the cold, clearly the top six, all have heat pumps. And then many of the other models on that list, some of them have heat pumps and some of them don't. So again, if this is important to you, definitely go look at that list, and you can dive into the data from Recurrent Auto some more. So far, we've talked about range specifically. So how far can you drive on a charge and how does the cold weather impact that? Cold weather also impacts the speed at which you can charge. So impacts range, but also charging. Basically, for the same reasons as we talked about with the battery earlier, things just happen more slowly when it's cold, and you'll see that in charging. If you charge at level 1, if it's very cold, and I mean like in the teens or in that 0 to like 15 degrees Fahrenheit, most of the energy will go to just warming the battery. So on those very cold nights where we get like 2 or 3 of them in a winter in New England, you might see that with level 1 charging. Otherwise, the place that you'll notice this most is in DC fast charging. So for those who are unfamiliar with those terms, level 1 charging is when you take your vehicle and you plug it into a normal 120 volt outlet, and it adds about 4 miles of charge per hour spent charging. That's called a trickle charge. It's the lowest type of charging. It works for some people, but not everybody. That's where you see that sort of most of the energy goes to warming the battery. Next level up is level 2. That's a 240-volt outlet. There you won't really notice a difference so much. You might notice that at the beginning of your charging session, most of the energy goes to warming up the battery, but then once the battery is warm, it continues to charge as normal. With DC fast charging, this is the type of charging that you might do on a road trip where you pull up and you stop, use the bathroom, have a cup of coffee, and charge for half an hour, and usually can basically replenish 80% of the vehicle's battery. There, if the battery is cold, at the beginning, the charging session is going to start more slowly because it's going to use just a little bit of energy to warm the battery up so that it can then charge fast more safely. And so you might notice that if you're on a road trip in the winter and it's very, very cold, you might notice that slower charging speed at DC fast charging. Increasingly, manufacturers are adding an ability to precondition the battery. And basically what that means is as you're driving, you can tell the vehicle, I'm headed to a DC fast charger. And the vehicle will say, okay, in that case, I'm going to take some of the energy that's stored in the battery and use it to warm the battery up to the optimal temperature for DC fast charging, so that when you get to the charging station, it knows we're ready to go and you can charge at the sort of normal DC fast charging speed. Some vehicles are so smart at this point that if you're using a navigation system in the vehicle and it shows that you're headed to this charging station, the vehicle will go, okay, you're heading to a charging station, you want to charge, I'm going to start preconditioning the vehicle. Other models, you have to go and press a button on the screen and basically initiate the battery conditioning. But if you do want to do some long road trips in the cold, this is something to take into account. There's an article here that we link to if you want to learn more about this. But for most people, this is not going to be something you need to think about. But if you regularly do really long road trips in the winter or want to make sure that when you do a road trip, you're doing it as fast as possible, this is something to consider looking into. So far we've talked all about temperature. Now we're going to talk about weather, specifically snow and ice and sleet and all of that. So first question is, how do EVs handle in the snow? Um, EVs have a low center of gravity compared to most modern vehicles, and that's because the battery is quite heavy, and a lot of electric vehicles have what's called a skateboard design, where the vehicle battery is basically in the floor between the wheels. And so that low center of gravity helps with vehicle handling in slippery conditions. Many EVs now come with all-wheel drive options, which I know a lot of New Englanders absolutely feels required. So there's a lot more options with all-wheel drive now than there used to be. And it's worth noting that you may want to consider snow tires. So electric vehicles have specific tires that are built to withstand A, the additional weight of the battery, but B, the better torque of the vehicles, because these vehicles can accelerate a lot more quickly than gas-powered vehicles. So the all-season tires that you get on an EV are specific to an EV. Some people will notice that the tread is a little different, and in certain slushy conditions, they drive a little bit different. It depends on the vehicle that you're talking about, but there are snow tires available. It's the same sort of trade-off that you see with snow tires in a gas-powered car, that you have a little bit better grip, but the vehicle is a little bit less efficient because there's more friction happening. So there's lots of resources online, and some manufacturers even have specific recommendations on that front. But ultimately, that's a very personal decision based on where you drive and what you're looking for. But it is something to think about if you regularly drive in the snow. Another question we get a lot is, can I charge outside even if it's cold or freezing or rainy or slushy? And the answer is yes. Um, Home chargers come with different ratings, and there's an organization called NEMA. I honestly can't remember now what the acronym stands for, but they have different levels of rating for electrical appliances. And if you have a NEMA rating of 3 or 4, that means that unit is built to withstand weather. So you can have it sitting in the snow, sitting in the rain, sitting in freezing temperatures outside, and it will be fine. Um, when you look at different electric vehicle supply equipment, EVSE, or basically the charging unit that you see in this photo, you can look up that NEMA rating. And our electric utilities in Massachusetts and Rhode Island also have a list of charging stations that they've kind of approved for home use, and you can sort of start there as a short list to see which ones work. But there's absolutely chargers that do fine outside. A lot of people are very nervous about the chargers freezing to the car. That really shouldn't happen. There have been some reports of that happening um, over the years, but you can solve that problem basically the same way you would if your door handle freezes, which is give it a bit, warm it up a little bit. It should be fine, but it really is not, I think, an issue at the same scale as some of the reports have made it out to be. Um, moving right along. This is basically already almost the end of this presentation. There are some top tips, and then we'll go into some questions. But top tips are preheat your vehicle and precondition your battery when you can. So if you are able to plug in your vehicle before you drive somewhere and just have it charge up the battery, you can even turn the vehicle on, heat up the cabin, make it nice and toasty before you get in. That means you will draw electricity from the grid to do all of that while you're plugged in, rather than drawing from your battery. And that means when you leave, not only are you comfortable, but the battery is comfortable. It's going to work more efficiently than it would have otherwise. And you've taken some juice from the grid rather than the battery to do that and prolonged your range. The beauty of EVs is that you can turn them on in a garage and not worry about poisoning anybody, because if they're running on electricity, there's no exhaust, there's no fumes coming out. And then secondly, as I mentioned, if you're going to DC fast charge, preconditioning the battery specifically is a good idea. Not all vehicle models have that capability, but increasingly the new ones do. Next, use the seat warmers and the steering wheel warmers. They are more efficient than heating the cabin air, and often they're honestly they're enough. So the more you can rely on those features rather than increasing the cabin air temperature another 2 or 3 degrees, the longer your battery will last, because those features are just more efficient. I'll say that in all of these EVs, there's always on the dashboard basically a display of how many miles of range you have left available to you. And anytime you turn on one of these features, the vehicle will adjust in real time. So if you're driving along and decide to blast the heat, the range display will say, okay, now that we're blasting the heat, your range is decreased. And so you can sort of play with it a little bit and say, okay, I turned it up a degree. What happened? Oh, I'm going to turn that down a degree and instead use my heated steering wheel. You'll get a feel for the particular vehicle that you drive to see how much it's impacted. Some vehicles also have a feature where you can basically on the screen say, show me where energy use is going, how much of it is going to driving, how much of it is going to basically temperature, how much of it is going to other features. And so that's another place where you can sort of play around with it and say, okay, how much energy does this really use? And where is my comfort level in terms of range and temperature? Next is a couple things that you can do just in terms of how you drive and how you treat your vehicle, which will make you a more efficient driver regardless of what fuel type you're on. One is no lead foot. The less you can slam on the accelerator and then slam on the brakes, the less energy you waste. So if you are sort of a calmer driver, that is also good for you and for the vehicle's range. Uh, Regenerative braking is a really cool tool in electric vehicles. If you haven't heard of this before, basically what this technology does is if you've turned it on and you want to slow your vehicle down, when you take your foot off of the accelerator, the vehicle will recognize that you want to slow down and will slow you down basically by spinning magnets around the wheels backwards. To take that energy that would have otherwise been lost to friction and put it back into the battery. And so regenerative braking has two effects. One is that it increases your range because you're taking energy that would have otherwise been lost and putting it in the battery. It also means that you don't have to replace your friction brakes as frequently, but particularly in winter when every mile counts, if you use regenerative braking when you're stuck in traffic in the city, for example, you can restore a lot of the miles you might have otherwise lost. Um, Another sort of fact, which is true regardless of what type of vehicle you're driving, clean the snow off, clean the snow and ice off. If you've got a lot of snow and ice on your roof, that increases drag, which means you need more energy to physically push through the air. So the more you can clean off your car, the more efficiently it will run. Again, whether it's EV or gas powered, but either way, it's a good idea. And then finally, if you can park and charge somewhere warm, your vehicle will thank you. And literally, if you want to park in the sunny side of the parking lot rather than the shady side of the parking lot, that can help. But particularly if you can park inside, which I know not everybody can in every instance, but the vehicle's battery will be happier if it can stay just a little bit warmer. That is already the end of this presentation. I see we've got a couple questions in the chat that I'll get to in just a moment. But what I want to mention is we've got a couple other webinars coming up if you want to learn more about electric cars. So on Friday at noon, we'll be talking about a new EV demand response program in Rhode Island, where you can basically get incentivized by Rhode Island Energy to charge in a way that works for the grid. We've got a whole deep dive next week on Wednesday into EV charging. So if when I was talking about level 1, level 2, and level 3 charging, you were like, what is that? That's a good webinar to go to. We'll talk about how charging works, how to install it in home, how to find it on the go, all those things. And then in the new year in February, we'll have a deep dive into understanding the Massachusetts More EV state rebate program for electric vehicles. It has a lot of sub programs now. And so we'll run through all of those in addition to the federal tax credit, whatever state it is in at that point. I will say, I'm contractually obliged to say, we are a nonprofit organization and we really think it's important to make information like this available to the public for free. It is donation season, so if you are so inclined and able, we would welcome any donations to support both our programs and our advocacy work and everything else that we do to support our mission. And with that, I will turn to questions. I will say there's a couple different ways that you can stay engaged with us if you have more questions after this or want to talk to some real EV drivers. We have a community Facebook group, which you can join on Facebook, where we've got current EV drivers, prospective EV drivers, just sort of sharing information, asking questions. Hopefully we'll give you the feel of like being at an event with some EV drivers, even in the winter when we're all huddled up at home. You can follow us on social media. We've got a quarterly newsletter. You can sign a pledge that your next car will be electric. There's lots of ways to stay engaged. But I see a lot of questions, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go take a look at some of these questions. Okay. Hold on just a moment. Let's see. Okay. Lots of great questions. I'm just going to take them from the top. So, one question here about level 2 public chargers in the US have reliability problems. So there's been a lot of reporting on this that sometimes when you roll up to an EV charging station, it might not work. And this is a growing pain in the industry that is being addressed from lots of different angles right now. But the question is, do I think that the US will change to the European style of public charging where you bring your own cord? So in the US, mostly right now, if you roll up to a level 2 charging station, there's a cord on the station that you sort of pull out and plug into your vehicle. And that's where sometimes things break or need to be replaced. In Europe, you, the driver, carry a cord around with you and sort of plug in at the station where you arrive. I honestly don't know. I think this is a really exciting space. What I can say is there are a couple of companies that are bringing that model to the US, mostly in New York City, but now also in Boston. So the city of Boston has 2 curbside charging programs where they are testing out installing charging on the street. through two different models. One is they're doing some city-owned and operated stations, and another is they've got some public-private partnerships. And they actually just announced this week that the first of those chargers are like installed and working. And there's some cool videos online if you want to learn more. But one of the partners in that program is a company called It's Electric, which is doing exactly that. They are a bring your own charger model. This is the first time that that's being tried in Massachusetts, and the stations literally were just installed this week or came on this week. So I think it's very early. Really curious to see what happens on that front. I'll say more broadly on reliability, this is a an issue that is being tackled in a lot of different ways. So all of the federal funding that is coming down the pike for charging installations has reliability requirements attached to it. So for that funding, the stations have to have an uptime of 98%. So they need to be working 98% of the time. And just this fall, in the climate law that was passed in Massachusetts, the law directs I think it's the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs to study those federal standards and figure out what kind of standards and regulations we can put in place on the state level to ensure that the stations that are installed are reliable. So in Massachusetts, we've got an electric vehicle infrastructure coordinating council, or EVIC. And this is a top topic of conversation for that body. And their meetings are public if you ever want to speak on this to them. EVIC is definitely thinking about this. Okay. Next question. So there's a question about for those of us who have barely been able to afford a used Bolt and thus can't even use most DC chargers in New England, what do you all foresee as a way to extend range for us? So I hope I'm understanding this question correctly. And Leslie, if I didn't, please send another note in the chat and I'll try again. But a couple things. So the long and short of it is we need to build more charging stations. The vehicles that are coming online keep getting more and more efficient and keep getting longer and longer ranges and keep getting better and better at handling the winter, and that trend's going to continue. But obviously, it will take a little while for that to trickle from new vehicles to vehicles that are available on the used market. What I will say is there are a lot of different pots of money working towards installing more charging stations. So I mentioned federal infrastructure funding. That's the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program. That is money that the state, both Massachusetts and Rhode Island, have gotten to build DC fast charging stations along highways. But in addition, there are state programs in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. And then in Massachusetts, our electric utilities also have programs, all of which help bring down the costs of installing chargers, both at residential locations, multifamily locations, businesses, fleets, public lots. And there's hundreds of millions of dollars coming down the pike in the next couple of years to build out more charging. So I would say if you are an individual trying to figure out how to drive an EV in New England, I would say use the Drive Green shopping tool that we have to figure out different models and what kind of range you might be looking for. But then also we can send this information out in the email afterwards. See what incentives you're eligible for to install charging at home or to have your landlord install charging at home or find public charging nearby. So I hope that answers the question. Next question is, how does regenerative braking affect winter driving slash grip in bad conditions? I honestly don't have a good answer to this question, so we'll do some research and get back to you. Because it doesn't use friction, it's sort of a smoother way to slow down. But we'll ask some of our EV drivers actually in our network and see what their experience has been. A related question is there any downside to using regenerative driving 100% of the time? Um, I would say the only downside is that sometimes you want to be able to coast, like you don't want to slow down when you put your accelerator, if you take your foot off the accelerator. And that's mostly if you're driving on the highway. So if you're driving on the highway, you might want to ease up on the accelerator a little bit, but not like slow down as much as you would if you were doing city driving. And on the highway in particular, you want to stay as efficient as you can. You want to take all the energy that you can and keep it towards moving because of the speed at which you're going. So I think a lot of people will turn regenerative driving on or up for city driving. It's really useful if you're in stop and go traffic because then you don't even have to move your foot to the brake pedal. You can do what's called one pedal driving and just sort of ease on and off the accelerator. But when you're on the highway, a lot of people turn it down or turn it off. And different vehicles have different ways of doing this. Some of them have literally a button on the steering wheel. Others have like a little knob where you can turn it up or turn it down. But yeah, I would say on the highway, you can turn it off, but you can play with it too in the vehicle and see the impact you're having on your range. Um, Question about charging types. Most chargers are Tesla type. Are there any adapters for other vehicles? So this is a great question and a very timely question because yes. So when you look at a map of public charging, you'll see chargers that are Tesla charging stations, and you'll see chargers that are non-Tesla, and those will have different plug types. Historically, for level 2 charging, Tesla did their own thing, and then everybody else used a standard called the J1772. And for DC fast charging, the industry was split a little bit more between the Tesla standard, CHAdeMO, and a CCS. What those are exactly doesn't matter. It just matters that they were different. What's happening now is that the industry is converging on one standard, which is basically the Tesla standard, except it's now open to other automakers. It's called the North American Charging Standard, or NACS. And different automakers are at different points in the process of transitioning over. So every major automaker has indicated and signed an agreement that they will transition. Um, they're just in different places. So if you drive a Ford vehicle, a Rivian vehicle, a Chevy vehicle, or the Nissan Ariya, there might be a couple other models too. There are now adapters available, and we recommend that you buy one through the manufacturer of your vehicle because they'll have made sure that it really works. There's some third-party ones floating around on the internet. I wouldn't quite go that route just yet. Go with the one recommended by the manufacturer. And other manufacturers should be making those adapters available supposedly in 2024. Might take a little longer, but in the coming months, more and more are making those adapters available. Starting with model year 2025, they will start building those charging ports directly into the vehicle. So all new vehicles will come with the same charging port. And many charging stations now have plugs of both types available to you. So it's a little weird right now because we're in this transition moment, but this is really good news for consumers because moving forward, you won't have to worry anymore about do you have a CHAdeMO vehicle or a CCS vehicle. It's just going to be the North American Charging Standard, which is the same plug for level 1, level 2, or level 3 charging. So it should be a lot smoother moving forward. So the best thing to do if you are currently drive a particular vehicle is contact a dealer or look at the manufacturer's website about that particular car and whether there's an adapter available yet. But we've already had people write a blog post for us who drive a Ford Mustang Mach-E or a Rivian and have gone and used a Tesla charging station. The next question is, do all these efficiency principles apply to plug-in hybrids? Yes, basically everything that I've said in terms of um, uh, clearing snow off the car, parking your vehicle in a warm place, all of that applies whether we're talking about a fully electric vehicle or a plug-in hybrid. With a plug-in hybrid, I would just make sure that when you turn the vehicle on, you follow the instructions of that particular car to use electricity rather than run the gas engine in your garage because we want to avoid that. But all the general principles are all true. Um, a question from Laura that says, when the weather gets colder, I notice I couldn't even charge my car to the same number of miles. Warmer weather gets me around 280 miles, but in colder weather, it would only charge up to 260 miles. Is that normal? Yes. That's the range decrease of that 10 to 30% that we're talking about. The number that you see on your screen is generated by a computer in the car, basically saying, okay, given the amount of energy that's in the battery, how far can I drive? You're still putting in the same amount of energy to fill up that battery all the way. The battery management system is just going, okay, I know it's cold, therefore we're going to get fewer miles out of the same number of kilowatt hours. So that is totally normal. Um, totally normal. Um, Another question, for some rechargeable batteries, charging when the batteries are cold will lower their capacity over time. Is this also true for EV car batteries? So we're talking about range in lots of different ways. This question is about range over the life of the vehicle. So if at the beginning, when the vehicle was new, you got 350 miles per charge, you can over time see that batteries degrade a little bit, and 10 years from now, that same vehicle with the same battery will only get 300 miles per charge when you fully charge it. I made up those numbers, but that's the principle we're talking about here. The main thing that causes battery degradation over time in EV batteries is the introduction of heat, which is mostly from DC fast charging. But already the vehicle battery management systems and battery temperature regulation systems have gotten a lot better in just the last couple of years. So this is becoming less and less of an issue. But no, charging the batteries when cold should not lower the capacity over time because these vehicles have those really sophisticated battery management softwares that a normal sort of rechargeable battery won't. So the vehicle will recognize, okay, it's cold, you want to charge the battery. We're going to start slowly to warm up the battery first, and then we're going to ramp up to normal charging speed. That's why charging is slower when it's cold, is that battery management system is protecting the battery. Um, how do you find out what kind of heating system you have? You can look in the sort of owner's manual, I'm sure, but the easiest thing would probably be to look at the list from Recurrent Auto and see, are you on that? Is the vehicle that you own on that list? If yes, then you've got a heat pump. If no, then you've got a resistive heater. Um, got a clarifying question saying, so level 2 charging does not really need battery preconditioning. I would say, yeah, it doesn't really need it. If it's really, really cold, you could do it, but with level 2 charging, you're likely going to be there for a while anyway. And so if there's a delay in the first bit of charging where the battery is taking energy from the grid and warming itself up rather than filling itself up, that's less noticeable in level 2. If you're like already going to be plugged in for 3 or 4 hours or overnight, you won't notice that as much as you would with DC fast charging. Um, I honestly don't know if the different vehicle models have like I'm preconditioning for DC fast charging specifically versus level 2 feature. We can look into that and get back to you. But from everything we've heard from EV drivers and read, it's mostly for DC fast charging. But it doesn't, I don't think it would hurt. Um, Next question is, what kind of plug does the bring your own charger model require? Great question. I don't know. We'll find out for you. It's so new that I haven't even seen the stations yet myself. I think for the It's Electric model, they send you a plug or you purchase a plug from them to be able to use their charging network. So on one end, it will have the J1772 or the Tesla plug to plug into your vehicle. And on the other end, I honestly don't know. So we'll add that to the list of things to follow up on. Um, There's a comment that some newer Tesla superchargers have built-in adapters so non-Tesla cars can use them. This is true. This is called a magic dock. So if you are a non-Tesla driver, there's basically two ways that you can use a Tesla charging station. One is you bring your own adapter to a Tesla charging station that has enabled this, or the other is that you specifically go to a Tesla charging station that has this magic dock adapter built in. Um, I, I'm really curious to see how much more of that magic dock they build out, given that a lot of drivers will now have their own adapters, but that is very true. And you can find that on any of the apps, basically, where you find charging stations. You can filter for magic dock. Um, have a comment here from Harold, who it sounds like is an EV driver, who wrote, if you keep regenerative braking at full efficiency, you will get used to one pedal driving, so you don't need to take regenerative braking off for highway driving. Much safer. So that's some feedback from, sounds like a real life EV driver. Um, Another question about charging. So a lot of times if you read about EV charging, it's recommended that you only charge to 80%. Because batteries like a little bit of a buffer. They don't want to be fully full or fully empty. So the question is, to increase range in cold weather, is there an advantage of going to 100%? I'll first say that when the vehicle says that it's at 100%, it is lying to you a little bit. It has built in a buffer. So when you charge to 100%, there's still space or room left in that battery. The battery management software has that built in to protect the battery. There's no harm in going to 100% if you need to go somewhere and it's cold and you want to be extra sure. I think in general, if you can stay between 50 and 80%, that's the ultimate best thing to do. But if it's cold and you need to get somewhere, charge to 100% and it'll be fine. Um, Someone has a question saying that their used Kia Niro didn't come with a level 1 charging cable. And Kia said that the cost for a new cable is $530 for a kit. Do I really need a whole kit or just a cable I can probably find on Amazon? $530 seems extreme. We will do some research and get back to you on that because I want to make sure we're telling you what's absolutely true. The one thing that is very true, sort of across the board, if you're looking at charging things for EVs, is you want to make sure they are UL listed. That's the Underwriters Laboratory. That's a sort of a technical engineering firm that tests things and makes sure they're legit, pretty much. And so you can find charging cables or charging units online that are not UL listed. We definitely recommend you make sure they're UL listed, and it'll say right on the package if they are. Um, Someone has a question saying, is an electric vehicle the right car for me? I live in Boston. I use the car only for recreational use, average less than 25 miles a week. Um, big open question for this person is, where do you park? And I would say if you want to send us an email at drivegreen@greenenergyconsumers.org, we're happy to talk through that because it depends on where you're going, where you park. I will say that there's plenty of people in the city of Boston who have electric cars. If you average less than 25 miles a week, you could get away with charging every other week, it sounds like, and you could do that at one of the level 2 charging stations or DC fast charging stations around the city. Maybe wherever it sounds like only for recreational work use, you don't need to charge at work, but definitely doable. But there's nuances that we're happy to talk through with you. Um, Got a nice comment from a Kia EV6 owner saying you can get the cable on Amazon, no worries. You don't have to buy through the dealer. Great. Um, and okay, let's see. We're coming up on 1 o'clock, so I will answer as many of these questions as I can, and then we'll follow up in an email. So one question is, my car doesn't have heated seats. Can I have that feature installed? I don't think so. This is a technology that is getting installed in lots of vehicles, electric or not, because people just like it. But I think more modern EVs basically have it standard because they figured out that this is a really useful technology to have. Unfortunately, I don't think you can install it after the fact. Um, okay, I think we might stop there. Just given the time. So I will say there's a couple questions here about I came late. Was there a recording? Yes, we will share a recording. We will share all the slides and the resources that we've mentioned. And we'll also do a little homework on some of the questions that we needed to double check on. I will say thank you very much for joining us. I hope you learned something and had a good time. And I want to say thank you again for understanding that we had to move this up a week. But hopefully you had a good time and stay warm, and you'll see an email from us soon.